Well, thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Demetrius and Dr. Landry. This is a topic that I've been deeply involved in for a very long time, kind of scary length of time, in fact. Chose the title of Environmental Justice and Sustainability, which kind of seems a little bit contradictory. We see environmental justice as kind of a specific diversity-focused kind of issue, where sustainability is everything from global climate change and acid rain and so on. So how are those two related? To me, they're so intertwined as to be inseparable, that the reason we have so much contamination in our communities today, I think, is because we've not had environmental justice in the past. If we had to experience the waste byproducts of our industrial consumer society, we would not be polluting as much. But we've kind of outsourced the pollution byproducts so that we can have our nice technological lifestyles. I drove over here this afternoon from Indianapolis, and if I had my exhaust pipe blowing into the cabin of my car, I obviously would have died long before getting here. The fact that we put it out the back is the same as what we do with all of our pollution. We put it somewhere else, so we get the good stuff that we like, and the bad byproducts, well, they're somewhere else. And as a result, we don't think about the byproducts. And environmental economists have helped us with that. You know, they've come up with, well, what is the real cost of the electricity that we use, or the real cost of any of our items when we take into account all of the pollution that is generated in creating all of these consumer products. They'll give us a price. I was just reading a report recently on the cost of electricity. The cost of electricity would be double if we really had to include all the costs involved in generating electricity. But that's bogus, because the impact of generating electricity, particularly using coal, is not just a dollar figure. It's people's lives being shortened. It's people having asthma attacks. It's people having such severe emphysema that they can't get out and enjoy the beautiful day that we have today. Our economists think they can put a dollar figure on that, and they do, and we buy it. We go, oh, well, we just need to pay more for our electricity and everything will be good. But it's not, because there are people that are suffering because we separate out the good stuff that we want as a consumer society from all the pollution that we generate. In fact, when I was teaching in University College Dublin in Ireland, I was taking a train across Dublin on the way, across Ireland on the way to Dublin, and I had these environmental issues on my mind, and I'd been doing environmental racism research prior to moving to Dublin. And out the window of the train, I saw a sign that said, poisoned field. I thought, well, I'll have to ask people, you know, what's going on over here. They have these poisoned field. So when I got to Dublin, I asked some of my colleagues, you know, what was meant by that. I thought, you know, it must be some terribly contaminated. Oh, that just means they put some pesticides on to kill the weeds. So in the United States, our whole country would be poisoned by that standard. And so I was continuing my research in Dublin while I was there and meeting with environmental leaders. I said, you know, well, where are toxic waste sites? Because that's what I was looking at. And they said, well, we don't really have any. We export our toxic waste to England. They pay us a lot of money for it. Dennis Thatcher, Maggie Thatcher's husband, made a fortune in importing toxic waste and burying them in England. So the Irish had figured out how to get back to the Brits. They offloaded their waste across the Irish Sea. Of course, the Brits were getting them back with waste that they put into the Irish Sea. At any rate, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I got involved in this topic. and kind of where we stand with what environmental justice is today. I got involved in 1982, almost exactly 30 years ago. That's kind of scary about it. It's been 30 years I've been doing this stuff. And what happened was a friend of mine got a job that he felt really guilty about. His wife had just had a baby and needed to make more money, and he was working as a bailiff, not making much money at all. And so he got a job as an IT consultant with a big law firm that did legal work for most of the major corporations in the state. They hired him to come up with a program that they could use to limit the liability of their clients, basically, in environmental pollution cases. And he felt very guilty about that he was really working for the devil, and his heart wasn't in working for the devil. So he started passing data to me. It wasn't kind of undercover data. It was stuff that was publicly available, but the public didn't know that it was available. The Superfund legislation that was passed in 1980 included a community right to know legislation that did what it says. The community has a right to know, and states were mandated to collect data on all of the contaminated sites within their state and make them available to the public. Well, I didn't know that, but he gave me a 48-page, single-spaced listing of all of the known toxic waste sites in the state of Indiana. Now, Indiana's a little smaller than Ohio, but 48 pages, single-spaced, one site per line. I think there were 50 on a page. So a lot of sites. Now, these weren't all terrible ones. These are ones that needed to be investigated. So I started doing that in 1982. Robert Bullard in the South in 1984 began looking at the location of landfills and power plants and noticed that they were all located in African American communities. And so he began using the term environmental racism, which certainly fit a lot of what the data that I was collecting suggested, although there were also cases where it was more environmental classism that we dump on low-income people almost irregardless of ethnicity or skin color. So I decided, I went to our environmental department and said I'd like a map of all the toxic waste sites in the state so that I could begin looking at what the characteristics were. And they looked at me like I was from Mars and said, we don't have anything like that. And so I kept on them for several years saying, you know, have you mapped this stuff out? It was clear that they were never going to map it, that they didn't want people, you and I, to be able to look at a map and go, wow, this is right next to my house, or this is in my community. I've never heard of the place before. A lot of big polluters don't put their names in neon lights out in front, so a lot of these go relatively unnoticed. So anyway, I began looking at the state overall, where the sites were, and the characteristics of the communities around them, to take a look and see to what extent environmental racism was occurring, whether environmental classism was occurring, or whether neither was occurring. Really hadn't been any research focused on that. And there was nothing kind of comprehensive to work from. So looking at the state of Indiana back in the 1980s, what was clear was that it was definitely a relationship between class and race both, and of sites that were the most serious, as rated by the environmental scientists that went out to the site and determined it. The most polluted sites were in low-income African American communities, looking at the state as a whole. There were a few sites that stood out that I wanted to learn more about, and the timing happened that one of them came to the fore in the early 1990s. It was a site that a subcontractor for a large pharmaceutical company in Indianapolis did work for, and they apparently had a lagoon out back, and they just put their waste products in the lagoon. Eli Lilly and Company, the pharmaceutical company, purchased Marion acid manufacturing plant and just put some dirt over it. All right. Done. Actually, I think acid manufacturing plant had done that before they sold it. The Lilly Corporation went to build a new building on the site, and when they got through the crust of the earth, they hit all this toxic waste. So instead of reporting it as they were legally required to, they decided that it wasn't a threat to public health. This is in a low-income, primarily white community. A lot of people from Appalachia had moved to Indianapolis over the decades, and this is populated by a lot of people, white folks from Appalachia. I knew about this site, and at the time that I was doing this research, the corporation had convinced the city to close a major 6-lane street, actually a state highway, that ran through their complex and rerouted around the edge of their campus. The state was putting in about $50 million on the project. I thought that was kind of odd that we would be subsidizing a company that was in violation of federal environmental laws. And so I wrote a letter to the editor in the newspaper questioning that. You know, how can we be subsidizing a corporation that flaunts environmental laws? The corporation's response was that they had patent protection, that they didn't have to reveal what was in the contaminated site, because if they did, it would give information to their competitors on the chemicals they were using in their manufacturing process. I don't know about you, but I was pretty offended by that their patent protection was more important than protecting people living across the street or people working on the site, because there were thousands of employees on this campus. So that was one experience I had where this notion of environmental justice, environmental equity, comes up against some pretty strong competitors out there, and patent protection was one of them. They didn't like my nosing around. A friend of mine was meeting with the Lilly Corporation people. They didn't really know that he knew me. They said, well, we'll take care of that Maher guy. So they were pretty upset that any questions being raised about their ability to declare any waste site protected by patent protections. Another piece of data in the statewide study I did was the oldest site, because one of the problems you get into in environmental racism or classism, either one, is that people will say, well, those people moved into close proximity to the site after it was built. That's not racism. That's people making a free choice about where they live. I said, okay, fair argument, and that's easily testable. So I went to the 150 most serious toxic waste sites in the state, and I went into the historic censuses and went to the census prior to the opening of each site, so you could see, you know, what came first: African Americans, poor people, Hispanics, or the plant, and then that would answer the question, right? And so in doing that, I found that the overwhelming evidence was that, in fact, particularly in terms of racism, that the populations were there first, and the plants moved in later. Not always the case, and the next case I want to talk a little bit about is one of those. There was only limited data available on this particular site, even though it was the oldest contaminated site that the state had data on. And they didn't, the data was unavailable due to litigation. So if a company was in litigation, they were being sued, then the public no longer had the right to know, apparently. But I was able to collect data. It's hard to get census data from the late 19th century. But I was able to get data that suggested that there was a population around this particular site. So a little bit about the site itself. It's an interesting one, and it kind of frames the industrialization of the Midwest in many respects. It's a coke plant, not Coca-Cola and not cocaine. In fact, since I didn't have a PowerPoint, I thought some show and tell would help. So this is a piece of Coke. This is not illegal. It's hard to get it up your nose anyway, and it's the wrong color. What Coke is coal that is baked at 2,000 degrees for about 30 hours. And in doing so, it bakes out all the impurities in coal. Most of us don't look at coal very closely. But if you do, there's moisture in it, there's pieces of wood maybe in it, there are all kinds of imperfections in it. And as a result, it doesn't burn as hot or as well. But if you bake it that long at that high a temperature, you get rid of all that. So this weighs about 2/3 what a chunk of coal would weigh, that same size. And you use coke in blast furnaces, so making steel, and in foundries. So anything that has metal in it, big, heavy machinery, automobiles, those sorts of things, the kind of backbone of an industrial society, this product here is pretty important to it. Thank you. So the ability to have a wealthy industrial society, or in the case of Indianapolis, a wealthy industrial city, was dependent a lot on this plant that was started in 1908. The corporation insisted that when it was built, it was on the edge of the city. Of course, 1908, there's nobody really left around to give us a first-hand opinion on it. The maps are kind of ambiguous about it, but we did find building permits from 1886 for a church in an African-American neighborhood that sits right across the street from the entrance to the coke plant. They didn't expect us to be doing a lot of historical research, I guess. I got involved in this project not just because there was data missing from my earlier study, although that did prick my interest, but for 13 years I directed our university's Community Programs Center. And I established 2 centers in a neighborhood 3 miles north of campus to get our students out into the community. In fact, I've taught all my classes at one of those centers, a HUD-subsidized public housing project for the last 12 years. So I have a pretty deep relationship with the neighborhood, and the coke plant happens to be in that neighborhood. And so I had been in many meetings with coke plant representatives over the years. Was pretty familiar with the plant. And in 2007, the plant announced that it was closing after 99 years of operation. I thought, well, that's good for the neighborhood, although the neighborhood was kind of ambiguous about it because it was one of the few places where people without education could get a good paying job. You didn't even need a high school degree to work at the coke plant. And you can make a middle-class lifestyle. So there was some torn feelings in the neighborhood about the closing of the plant. But the neighborhood that the Community Program Center had been working closely with came to me and said, Tim, do you have any students that would like to do a practicum? working on a reuse plan for the Coke plant site. So I talked to some of my grad students, and yeah, it sounds kind of cool. And so we got involved in a very deep level with this plant. So where I had been looking at kind of broad level, looking at statistical relationships between sites and communities, this is one where I dug deeply into it. Part of the issue with the plant and with what the neighborhood wanted us to do, it was a very open site, 175 acres, centrally located in the city now, although true, it was kind of on the edge of the city when it was built in 1908. It's now very much inner city property, 175 acres, close proximity to the middle of a large city. That's a pretty prime real estate. And the neighborhood wanted some control over what happened to it, since they had suffered for a century from the pollution. They wanted something out of the fact that it was closing. So one of the first things that happened was one of my grad students was very eager to get going, and he was an amateur photographer as well as being a sociologist. So the next time we met, he said, "Dr. Maher, I went over to the Coke plant site the other day, walked right on the plant site, walked around for about 30 minutes, took 40 or 50 photographs. Nobody stopped me, nobody asked me any questions, nothing." He was surprised. In post-9/11 America, to have a major power plant that a person could just walk in off the street, wander around for a half an hour, take photographs, and leave without anybody asking any questions, seemed odd. You know, you got a strip at the airport, but you can walk into this power plant. We immediately contacted the neighborhood association that had asked us to do this work because we knew that was a threat. There are all kinds of environmental threats. We think of air pollution and so on, but in inner city neighborhoods, particularly as it relates to environmental justice, environmental threats are of all sorts. The neighborhood around it has the highest proportion of children of any part of the city of Indianapolis. You have a 175-acre site that totally pervious to people wandering in and out. You know, I thought back to when I was a 12-year-old, man, what a gold mine. You know, dangerous is all get out, which makes it even more attractive. A lot about the Coke plant makes you, well, one of my co-authors described it as being one of the layers of Dante's hell, right? Maybe a lower one even. And because they've been baking coal is very dirty anyway, been baking it for 100 years on this site. This is a massive plant, one of the biggest coke plants in the country. So everything on the ground is coal, probably several feet deep. There were some estimates of the cleanup that they would have to remove anywhere between 10 and 60 feet of soil to get rid of the contaminants. We did get some aerial photos of the plant, and you can see the outline of it because everything inside is coal black, everything. There are 8 miles of rail track on the site. Had their own train repair shop, over 100 buildings on the site. This is a pretty big operation. And in 2007, 2008, we eventually were allowed on the site. I was able to take half a dozen tours through the site, and repeatedly, every few feet, there'd be these black pools of black ooze, and then steam coming out of the ground next to it. And everything looked 100 years old also. So everything is either rusted, black, or ooze, or some kind of fumes. So it did resemble hell. So this is what kids could just walk into. A very exciting place. So the neighborhood got on the phone right away. and had police security there that evening. So, as we took a look at the coke plant site, we'd already discovered that, all right, this was a case of environmental racism, but it was more than that. This was a multi-generational experience of contamination. Very low-income neighborhood. People lived there many generations in the neighborhood. In fact, it ultimately had about 10 students involved in the project. We were sitting around one day trying to figure out how we could be positively involved with the neighborhood on this. And one of the students said, well, why didn't they just move away? I mean, this is so bad. The cases of respiratory problems and cancers and so just is mind-boggling. I said, well, where would you move? Well, they were kind of stumped on that because this is a really low-rent neighborhood. It's affordable housing. I said, where else in the city of Indianapolis could you live where you were not in the shadow of some similar type of plant? Nobody could come up with anywhere. So that's really what we're talking about with environmental justice, kind of the flip side of environmental racism and classism, is what do you do? You know, the people that live around the coke plant and have lived around the coke plant for generations have no place to move to that would be any improvement over where they have been living. So, on that particular site, what we did for the, in working with the neighborhood is we wanted to know what kind of health effects could reasonably be traced to the coke production. The process of coking involves emissions of hundreds of thousands of pounds of benzene a year. Benzene is a serious carcinogen, lots of respiratory problems, and we had a list in a film we made of it that went on for minutes with all of the health effects of exposure to benzene. If you're exposed to a lot of benzene, you die quickly. It's pretty nasty stuff. Naphthalene is a similar carcinogen that used to be emitted in the range of hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, but in the 1980s, severe restrictions were put on naphthalene, and so they now only emit like 20,000 pounds a year of this dangerous carcinogen. So one environmental threat was the fact that the place was open, that anybody could go in, and there were pits, there were just all kinds of, I was even scared taking my students there. We had to wear hard hats. They were pretty grimy, so my students complained about that because they had caked coke dust all over them. You had chemical pollution, the benzenes, the naphthalene, and then, you know, minor ones, cyanide. They dump 100 pounds of cyanide in a creek about a third the width of this room. I asked a chemist friend of mine, isn't that kind of bad? I thought cyanide is what people killed each other with in the movies. I said, no, that wouldn't be a problem. I don't know. Seems like it's a problem to me. Now, he's a chemist that works for corporations, so maybe they have a different way of measuring severity. So there are lots of chemicals that are released in the process of baking the coal. One of the byproducts is manufactured gas. And so they had about 150-foot tall storage tank on the site. In 1994, it blew up. So there are other kinds of environmental issues than just the spewing of benzene and so on. Cold January day, the way the storage tank worked had a dome top, and as it filled up with gas, the dome would go all the way up to the top, and as the gas was used, it would lower down. And during this particularly cold January winter, the dome had started to come down and gotten frozen in place. and then one side broke loose. And when it broke loose, of course, it created sparks that caused an explosion that shook the entire neighborhood. It took about a week for the fire to burn itself out. So there are, also these very acute instances of pollution, because that spewed chemicals even further out into the neighborhood in a very concentrated form. There was another type, and that is black soot. Black lung disease that miners get. Well, this is from black soot. And this neighborhood is coated in black soot. There have been other kinds of things that they've been coated in. We found in the 1940s that 400 homes around the plant turned purple because of chemicals the plant was using. So the city did get them to change the chemicals so that houses wouldn't turn purple. Although I did see some pictures just a couple days ago from the creek running through it that shows some rocks covered in a purple substance. So I'm wondering if that may be some of it. But black soot is probably the most serious problem. It too causes a lot of respiratory problems, but it also affects memory. And this neighborhood, not surprisingly, has the worst school performance of any part of the city. We found both benzene exposure and black soot exposure both affected short-term memory. And if you don't have a short-term memory, you're probably not going to do very well in school, or in your job probably either. So, in the process of working with the corporation, they immediately I was trying to contact them to get tours of the site and to be able to sit down, get them to sit down with the neighborhood. And they finally said, okay, but we only want to meet with you. I said, why me? I don't even live in the neighborhood. Well, I knew why they wanted to meet with me, because I looked like a middle-class white person like they were, and they could strike a deal with me, but these rowdy poor people over here, they didn't want to deal with. And I said, no, you're going to meet with everybody. And it was very useful because we had very good communication in the neighborhood. And so when the corporation would start lying in these meetings, everybody already knew the truth, except for the corporation that thought that we didn't talk to each other in the neighborhood. They immediately promised, this is late 2007, the demolition would begin in 2008, spring of 2008. It would take about a year to do the demolition, and about 3 to 5 years to remediate the land. So they couldn't really figure out how much remediation would be needed until they tore down the 100 structures on the site. So 2008, they start the remediation, 3 to 5 years. So by that schedule, we'd be almost nearing a clean site. Well, we're not. Although things are getting interesting. In 2009, my colleagues and I issued a report to the community, a 50-page report where we looked at remediated, similar sites that have been remediated in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, including some from China. China has a lot of coke plants. I had a Chinese student who wanted to work on the project, but his English was okay, but in this neighborhood with a 4th grade education level, they didn't really understand wrong. And so he wanted to participate somehow. I said, well, look up what China's done with coke plants. So he started giving me these fantastic reports, pictures inside coke plants in China, detailed things on the remediation. This is before the Olympics. They had to shut down 2 coke plants in Beijing so that the athletes wouldn't die off during the Olympics. And so there's really a lot of data on those 2 sites. I said, wrong, where are you getting this stuff? I said, well, my mother works for the government. These aren't really published yet. So anyway, this report had some pretty good stuff in it. We also talked to all the residents within a quarter mile outside the plant to see what they would like. So we put this report together. We presented it to the neighborhood at a neighborhood gathering. The organization that actually asked us to do it had ceased to exist by the time we got the project done. Academics take a long time, I guess, to get stuff done. But actually, that's a whole nother story as to why that organization doesn't exist, although I believe it was clearly related to their taking on the coke plant project. We presented the report to the Neighborhood Community Development Corporation, and they said that they would continue working with the coke plant on remediation. It was in 2009. Last year, because we do have a lot of connections throughout the community, we also got to know somebody that works for the demolition company that got the contract. Well, they don't have to tear it down until 2015, found out from them. So when we get into this issue of environmental justice, part of it is just how, it's one thing to say, for example, the environmental justice policy of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management is that when a corporation wants to open a new landfill, for example, the population characteristics of the surrounding communities have to be taken into account. Okay, so we're not just dumping on poor people. Unfortunately, it doesn't really deal much with enforcement. And so the remediation plans for this plant, nobody's enforcing them. Nobody's enforcing the environmental permits at all. Nobody's even making sure the site's secure. In fact, on Monday of this week, a person from the neighborhood came to me and said she had walked right on the site again, reminded me of my student. She took about 300 pictures. She walked through the creek that bisects the plant, taking pictures of the creek's condition, because that's a lot of what the neighborhood experiences. There's only, it's the only body of water, only recreational area in the neighborhood. She showed me pictures of black ooze coming up from the bottom of the creek bed, brown ooze coming up, a really bizarre blue color, kind of reminiscent of this kind of blue. Not a natural color at all. Brown and black, yeah, they might be kind of natural, but the blue, the burgundy color between the color of these chairs and the curtain in back there, and another shade of blue. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Nobody's paying attention to it. In fact, the health department measures water quality in what is unfortunately named Pleasant Run Creek that runs through the plant. But where they test the water is a mile and a half away. Actually downstream, but all they're measuring is E. coli. So, and that's a whole nother issue. We have lots of sewer problems in the city, and this neighborhood has a lot of that. So part of it is, you know, the neighborhoods just get so overwhelmed. The communities facing this get so overwhelmed. They have so few resources. If this neighborhood hadn't had a collaboration with the university, they would not really have any way of dealing with this very powerful corporation. This is one of the most powerful corporations in the city of Indianapolis that owns this site. In fact, they were just allowed to purchase our city's water and sewer systems. My colleagues and I put our data in evidence with the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission to challenge the sale of environmentally sensitive water supply, and they approved it anyway. So I'm not sure I have a real good ending. I think when we look at the siting of power plants and noxious factories, yeah, we may be doing a little better job, only in the sense that Well, our environmental laws are so strict that we put those plants somewhere else. Some other part of the world where there's a lot of poor people and oftentimes a lot of dark-skinned people. So our environmental justice laws don't really do much because now we're just shifting them to other parts of the world. What we do have is the same sort of racism and classism going on where communities that are powerless don't have any choice. They can't move anywhere else to get away from the pollution, and they can't get the attention of powerful people, and those powerful people then tend not to do much to ameliorate their situation. So my colleagues and I, we finished this project 3 years ago. We've gone on to other things, kind of depressed. We stay very much in touch with what's going on, but we've been depressed that there's been no action. None of the three of us live in the neighborhood. We're pretty committed to it, but we felt that it really needed to be a neighborhood-driven thing. We could provide the expertise, and nothing was happening until about 3 weeks ago. Got an email out of the blue inviting me to a meeting of the Fountain Square, the name of the neighborhood, Fountain Square Environmental Justice Committee on April 30th, 2 blocks from the entrance to the Coke plant. So it was clearly resident-driven. We're tired of waiting. Nobody's doing anything. So this group emerged. They're having another meeting in a couple weeks, actually a week and a half, and a big public meeting in June. So they have every intention of moving this back up into the public's attention. But it takes a long time, and it's not because the city government or state government or national government is abiding by environmental justice. It's because people in their neighborhoods taking things into their own hands and trying to move it forward. So when we talk about environmental justice, kind of go back to how I started with the idea of sustainability, that if we don't somehow make it so that everybody experiences this kind of contamination, there's not going to be a big push to draw back on our use of resources and create a more sustainable future. But if we can start spreading that out a little bit, spreading out the contamination, then middle class, upper class decision makers are going to say, this really isn't a good idea. It was an all right idea when we were dumping on those people over there, but if we can't do that anymore and we can't just dump on people in other parts of the country, then maybe we have to rethink how we actually make things and how important the consumer items are that we like so much.